But before he gets freedom, it's a long take of him just there.
Oh, he's contemplating. No,
He's contemplating.
You gotta learn how to speak. You speak the water buffalo. What are you doing, David? Welcome to Totally Pretentious, a podcast about great movies. I'm Sean.
And I'm David.
And on today's show, we're going to discuss Uncle Boonmee, who can recall his past lives, a 2010 Thai film written, produced, and directed by Apichatpong Weerasethakul. The film premiered at the 2010 Cannes Film Festival, where it received the Palme d'Or, the first Thai film to ever do so, by the way, according to the internet. I don't know if that's actually true. I did not bother to check the list.
And before we get started, a friendly reminder that we want to hear from you. Please share your suggestions with us about this and past episodes at skiffyandfanty.com/listenersuggestions. We want to put together a listener mailbag episode with your thoughts, questions, topic suggestions, and more, so please get those thoughts in.
Do it or else.
Exactly.
David will yell at you in French.
That's right. You won't want it. You want that to happen. Yeah.
No. That is direct to tears. So, David, I picked this movie.
You did.
I have to know, before we get to what will be an attempt to summarize what this movie is, what did you think about me selecting what I consider to be a quite strange and unusual film?
You mean, what did I think about the film, or the fact that you picked it?
Both of those questions.
Well, I thought the film was very good. I don't know that I won't say that I had an immediate stroke or anything. And you're picking it. I mean, I thought, in fact, that this was actually a really good pick on your part, and in fact, inspired me for my choice at the end of the show.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that makes me happy. I will say I watched this film in graduate school in the only grad level film class I've ever taken. And the only thing I really remember about this film before I rewatched it was the one scene that I still don't understand why it's here, which is the catfish princess scene.
I was going to guess that would be the scene.
Because it does come sort of out of nowhere, and we will probably come back to it, because I'm very curious what our thoughts would be. But I suppose we should get to, what is Uncle Boonmee, who can recall his past lives? So this film follows a family who lives in the Isan region of Thailand, which is, if you're looking at Thailand, that is the most eastish, bulbous chunk of Thailand. That's roughly that entire province. It primarily takes place at Uncle Boonmee's place, which is in a rural part of Thailand. He runs a farm where he grows tamarind and all of these things, and he is suffering from essentially a terminal kidney issue. He has a Laotian immigrant who is helping him deal with this condition. He has his sister and his nephew and all of these things, and in the course of his dealing with his impending death, he and their family are visited upon by his long-lost son, who has transmorphed into a monkey ghost person, and also his deceased wife, who returns as a ghost. Really, that's kind of the basic premise. A lot of this is very slice of life in structure, right? It's about people sort of living and existing, rather than necessarily there being an explicit plot, per se. Although you could argue there is a thread, because Uncle Boonmee does, in fact, pass away by the end of the film. But that's kind of the basic idea. There's a lot of strange imagery. It is haunting, but not scary, which I think is really important, because it does feature ghosts and the supernatural being presented quite without much fanfare. And while there is a moment of discomfort for the characters, that discomfort leaves very quickly. And it just sort of becomes, yeah, like my son's a monkey ghost person, and that okay, and we just moved on now, and everything's fine. That's kind of the basic idea. There's other stuff in here, including there's a fable, I suppose you could say, or a myth of a princess who doesn't appreciate her her countenance, as it were, and wishes she was more beautiful, who is essentially semi-seduced by a catfish.
Yeah, maybe more than semi.
Okay, she's seduced by a catfish. That is a fair point. A catfish god, lord of the water. It's a very unusual scene. But that's kind of the only scene that really kind of pulls us away from what is the main story of Uncle Boonmee and his family. Even the still photography we get towards the end is still to do with Uncle Boonmee's past, which I'm sure we'll come to. So, did I miss anything important, David? Do you think I got it?
No, I think you pretty much got it there, yeah.
I will say, he loves his water buffalo, just saying. Because that whole opening sequence is just this, like, water buffalo getting freedom, just running off into the Thai wilderness, which is kind of adorable.
Yeah, it's, I've never seen footage of a water buffalo kind of going, woohoo, and taking off for his own fun time. But, that was a charming moment.
So let's kind of get to talking about this film. So where do we start, David? Because this doesn't have any of the traditional markers of the films we've covered, where there's like very clear plot dynamics, or it doesn't have, I don't know, Lisa and the Devil, which is like surreal bizarreness. It has no links we can make to James Bond movies. All the actors in this are not actually actors by trade, as my understanding, because Weerasethakul loves to use non-actors in his productions. So this isn't even an actor's movie, as it were. It is meditative and strange. So where do you want to start?
Well, I think that what you just said there, it is very meditative. I was also thinking in the early stages, or the first part of the film, that this was in many ways the kindest ghost story I'd ever seen. It's a very gentle film, populated by gentle characters. Right, you're also not you're not going to get a protagonist and an antagonist in this film. I think it is, like you said, very very meditative. It is bringing us through this process of this man confronting his death. If I were to say it's him putting his affairs in order, I'd be grossly oversimplifying the film.
Yeah,
but there's an element to that. If we perhaps take that expression, and we know that he has done so monetarily and financially, right? Or he's the way he's leaving the farm to his sister and so forth. Also, the spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, the affairs are all being settled before his end.
Yeah, in a weird literal way, because the ghost elements of this, or the supernatural elements, are part of that process, right? Dealing with the loss of his wife, for example. And with his wife dealing with the afterlife, there's this line in there, like they're talking about heaven, and she just says like heaven is overrated. There's nothing there. Is the translation, and talks about what it means to be a ghost. That ghosts are attached to places, not to places, but to people, and to the living. And there's an implication in that brief conversation that upon Boonmee's death, she will not have anything she's connected to. And so what happens afterwards? It doesn't tell us explicitly.
No.
I took the implication to be that some kind of ceasing to be occurs. But what that means to a ghost, we don't know. Does that mean she just blips out of existence, or they go to some other afterlife? It never tells us, because I think that's not what the film's not interested in giving those answers. It's more interested about the questions and the personal stakes that people have in these things.
Yeah, and that scene is very poignant and ends on that question, right? At least the revelations, the explanations end on the explicit question when he asks, well, after I die, how will I find you?
Yes.
And he doesn't get that answer. It's not just, I guess, when you say it's interested in asking questions, and I agree completely, but it also goes out of its way to provoke questions. We can look at a film, to take a polar opposite, for example, like Dirty Harry, which is asking questions and not providing answers. But we understand completely what the questions are.
Yeah.
Whereas here, we have moments like that, with that question that is unanswered. But we have scenes like the catfish scene, like the ending, to take just two, which deliberately provoke questions on the part of the audience. Or at least certainly that was my impression as a Western viewer. and of course I need to have a very large caveat on everything that I'm saying, that I have a sense that there's a lot of stuff that I'm likely missing, that there's context that I simply do not have, and that perhaps I would be much less mystified about certain things if I had that context.
It's interesting you say that, because the director did an interview at one point where, I think for The Guardian, where he was asked almost directly about the catfish scene in particular, which I think we'll come back to, in which his answer was just like, you don't need to understand everything.
Yeah.
To a degree, this film is, the production of the film is sort of Weerasethakung's sort of homage to classic cinema.
Right.
Because it's done in 16 millimeter, which is a deliberate choice. He chose that because that's what he remembers from old Thai television, which was on 16 millimeter. It has all these classic styles, and he's even said in interviews that it's like his lamentation about the death of literal film, like actual physical film, because everything's moving to digital. But there's also this oddity to this in which I think while you can, some of the context of Thailand, which I know a little bit, that's relevant to the film, will help with some aspects of it. Other aspects, I don't think it's intended to be understandable in that kind of clear sense. Like the catfish scene in particular is like a fable that's in the like heart and center of this movie, but which has no obvious direct connection to anything else in the film, which can't be said of the still images we get, which do.
Right. So, okay. So I guess there's two things that struck me. One with regards to the catfish scene, and there I would, that's certainly, that and the ending struck me as being certainly scenes that were deliberately leaving me with questions, right? The ones that defied attempts to come up with an answer to. So to take a very loose analogy to Western cinema example, something like 2001: A Space Odyssey, which does something not again, deliberately leaving you with questions, right? Without
many,
yeah. So that kind of thing, and yeah, though you're right, there's no direct connection to the princess's fable between it and the rest of the film. On the other hand, we certainly have visual continuity in its setting in the forest, right? Which at first I thought those were still our characters, right? That they had just left the farmhouse and were, walking through the trees. It took me a moment to realize, oh, this is a completely different group of people. So there was visual continuity established there, and it taking place at night and so forth. But then the idea of the journey that's there, of the encounter with the supernatural, that's there, and the mating of the human with the supernatural, which is also paralleled with the story of Uncle Boonmee's son and how he becomes a monkey ghost, right? So there are connections, or they're in parallel, they're metaphorical, they're thematic, but they're not plot driven, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they're not. In and of itself, the princess story has a plot and resolution by itself, because the premise of that is she's a princess and she has disfigurement on her face and she doesn't feel beautiful, but she sees a reflection of herself, of what she looks like, and one of her servants is like kind of macking on her, and she thinks that he's only interested in the reflection he sees of what he imagines, not her actual face, and she doesn't feel beautiful. And so this catfish says, oh, like, calm your roll, lady, like, you're actually really beautiful. And she offers offerings to this catfish being, god entity, whatever it is, and then has a very intimate, I would argue, sexual encounter with the catfish, which also includes some images of what look like baby catfish being born, so we could talk about the metaphors there. But there is like a plot and resolution there. In bits and bobbles, there are these moments of plots, but as a whole entity, the film is not interested in, at least not a Westerner's conception of what we would say would be a plot.
And what I meant was not that the princess story didn't have a plot to it, didn't have a story, but rather it did not flow out of the story of Uncle Boonmee.
Correct. Yeah,
directly, right? It's connected in other ways, and I think that along the lines of what you just said too, that there is a story, but it unfolds more almost as a series of tableaux.
Yeah.
Now I saw the discussion of he's doing 6 different kinds of film styles, but I think what particularly, at least what dominated for me for most of the film, was the stillness of the camera, that we would get entire scenes with the camera immobile, the very, very long takes, and mostly shot in long shot or medium long shot, right? And it's the kind of thing, I mean, that you'll certainly encounter films with immobile cameras, long takes, entire scenes, long shot, medium long shot, coming out of, like the more sleep-inducing B movies of the 1950s and 60s, right? Some of the cheapest stuff. But like you look at any movie by Larry Buchanan, for example. But the thing is that's not at all what the case here is. The difference between a hack and a filmmaker, that these long, slow takes are hypnotic. They're beautiful to look at, and they are perfectly in keeping with the very low-key, quiet, meditative conversations, meditative in tone and content, and that's being mirrored by the film. There were moments where I was reminded a little bit of, or I was thinking a little bit of the work of Bela Tarr, which also has these very, very, very long takes, though in his case some of them can go on for 10-15 minutes or more, and that's not what we're getting here either. But it's I see a parallel in the sense of the kind of shot that in another context would put the audience to sleep, but doesn't here. That is a perfect marriage of the form and the content.
I think that's interesting, because I think in another context, this film would be viewed, or in another filmmaker's hand, I should say, not another context, this film would come across as quite dull. Because there's not a lot of what we would say is quote unquote action in the sense of its structure, right? Even when surprising events occur, it is incredibly, slow's not the right word, but it isn't a thing where his son returns and jumps into the room and it's like a big event. He sort of appears slowly, emerging as a pair of eyes and moving up the stairs through the darkness. There's a lot of this very calm, where people are considering what is happening right now. We're really just kind of inhabiting the space as this event's happening in a very slow, deliberate way.
It's a really good example of a story that is not a story that has conflict in it. Right? It's not based on that structure of the conflict-driven story. Especially intro, rising action, climax, conclusion. None of that.
Yeah, because this is a film that, while there is an issue that is resolved, it isn't necessarily that the film's about resolving the issue. It is just a thing, it's death. Death is the thing that occurs here. But it is a thing that is presented to us as, this is just a thing that happens. Not a thing that is necessarily happening to somebody, like some entity is bringing it upon him. It is a thing that just simply is.
Or a thing to be overcome.
And to some degree, I think there's a little bit of the character kind of coming to terms with his death, but it is still presented to us as being, Uncle Boonmee kind of comes across as, he knows what's coming, he is dealing with it, the family is dealing with it, but it's not a thing where we're over-dramatizing it to the point where it's sort of we must meditate on what death means, and we must have the philosophical conversation, and we got to have all of the feels. It's very much about, this is a thing that's happening, and this is a thing that's a part of these people's lives. They're just dealing with it as they would deal with it, and that's just it kind of feels more real in a way, I guess is what I'm getting at.
It's an exploration for Boonmee, and one filled with wonder, and it takes unexpected turns for him. He's not expecting to see the ghost of his wife or the transformation of his son, right? They are a surprise when they arrive. They are a nice surprise, right? So when he came here presumably to wind things up and wind things down, he didn't know it was going to go in this way. And so it then becomes his almost delighted, but always in this very, very low-key, gentle... I mean, he's one of the most gentle characters I have ever seen on screen.
Ironically, we will have to go back to.
But he's sort of saying, okay, so this is what my death is going to be. I didn't know it was going to be like this. And he advances through it step by step with whatever the new thing is that's being brought to him.
I think it's interesting you say that, like, they're startled, but then they just get over it. It's almost as if maybe the son had just sent a letter. Like, they wouldn't have been alarmed by his arrival at all.
Well, in fact, they're less alarmed by... I mean, the arrival of the son generates virtually no alarm, right? The sister calls him to come to the table, and they're sort of looking at him, and, oh, okay, well, your hair, you've let your hair grow out, right? I think is actually one of the comments. They ask, why do you look like that? I can think of two moments where someone looks alarmed. When the wife materializes, right? And it's one of those moments I had to rewind because it was genuinely startling because I didn't at first see her slowly appear, and suddenly she was there. And I had to go back, and it was a very, very simple special effect. But quite beautifully done because it's happening in it's another one of those long still takes. Your attention is focused to the right of the frame, listening to the conversation there. She starts appearing on the left, and then so you kind of react like the son, or like the sister's son, to his appearance. And then at the end, when the alarm briefly from the son, when he and his mother get up to go get something to eat, and he sees themselves still sitting on the bed watching TV. And there's this moment of, what the hell? Again, it passes almost immediately.
I love that way in which it just passes over is really interesting to me, I think, because it's the film sort of like taking the bite out of the supernatural altogether, that they're not actually supernatural. They're just natural.
Right, yeah.
Like the alarm is always about not expecting. I would think, like, if we think about like a traditional ghost story of how so many of us are familiar with ghost stories, like the ghost showing up is unexpected, but also it's super unwelcome. Like, we don't want to be visited by a ghost. But here the story is like, oh, I wasn't expecting my dead wife to show up as a ghost, but she's here now. Let's talk about some pictures. Or I wasn't expecting to see myself and my mother and I guess my sister sitting on the bed while I am walking out with, like, you wouldn't expect that, but that's what happens. And they just kind of go, all right, whatever. And they move on, which is such a refreshing look at the supernatural as not actually a thing of alarm or really requires much interrogation. Like, even when the son shows up, it's not so much that they're trying to attack his appearance. They just genuinely want to know, like, you look different than the last time it's almost like they're talking about, like, oh, you lost some weight. Like, that's kind of what they're talking about.
What have you been up to lately is what the question comes down to.
Yeah. And the answer is actually quite alarming. But they're just like, oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. Because the answer is, like, he met these monkey ghost people, and then he, like, got a monkey ghost wife and mated with her, and then he became a monkey ghost himself. And that's it. Like, he's not shocked by it, and there's no problem. It's just like, yeah, it's just a thing that happens. And I love that because you just don't see it often enough in a lot of our cinema. Even in films where the supernatural is assumed to exist, it's still like, oh my god, like, this is not supposed to be here. Whereas this is just like, yeah, it's fine.
Well, I mean, it depends entirely on the intent of the film, right? Of course, in a horror film, that's going to be the reaction, because if you don't get that, it's not a horror film. But if you look at a film like Truly, Madly, Deeply, that has a ultimately very matter-of-fact approach to ghosts. It's first reassuring, a way of coping with grief, and then eventually the ghosts are starting to become annoying because they're leaving the toothpaste uncapped, and they're just taking up too much space in the apartment, and it's all very, very matter of fact and very, very moving. So but that film is I don't want to say romantic comedy exactly. It certainly has its comic elements. It's a romantic drama, anyway. Definitely a three-hanky film, and one of your chances to see Alan Rickman play a genuinely nice character.
Oh, good.
He's the primary ghost.
I think it's interesting you say, like, intent matters here, because clearly there's a lot of intentions we've already talked about, like, an homage to classic cinema. There's all of those kinds of things here. There is clearly an intent of not telling the traditional linear story that we expect in a lot of Western cinema. But then one of the other things I think is interesting, what you said, was the intent in terms of horror, because while this film it is not by any stretch of the imagination a horror film, because that is not its interest. Its interest is not terror in any way, shape, or form. But it does have buried underneath it horrific elements, because one of the things that this film talks about very briefly, but does not necessarily spend time really unpacking, is the history in Thailand of communist insurrections and insurgencies, because this region of Isan is one of the regions where the first major altercation between Thai security and the sort of like communist insurgency essentially began, in this same region, in a place called, I think it's Nabwa. And there are references at two separate points to this from Uncle Boonmee's past. One is with his sister, when they're talking about whether or not he's a good person, and he says, like, am I really? And she says, well, you killed people, but you were killing communists, but the intent matters because you were killing them for the nation, is essentially what she says. And then later we get those still images which show soldiers parading around a man in essentially a gorilla suit, at one point with essentially like a noose around his neck, dragging him around, which seems to be yet another reference to the way that region has historically been treated because of its communist leanings historically, because that's where a lot of the Asan region had a very large insurgency of communists, but many of the local community were interested in being part of that, and they thus suffered as a consequence during a lot of the anti-communist actions there. And Weerasethakul has talked about this a little bit in some of his interviews about how people in that region have historically been treated by the Thai government because of their links back to communism. And I think it's really interesting that that's there, because while we're not shown any explicit or violent imagery per se, with exception perhaps to those still images being in a sort of more metaphorical sense of violence, the implication is that Boonmee has in the past done horrific things in the service of his country, and in his dying days is sort of thinking back and wondering, does that make me a bad person? Right? Karma, is this my karma? Is that what all this is, coming back to bite me in the ass? His sister offers Jen kind of offers, I guess, a solution to that, but it's unclear if Boonmee fully accepts it, because again, this is the film, it raises it, and then it leaves us with the question of, what do we think Uncle Boonmee has come to the conclusion of here? And I don't think he actually necessarily agrees with her or has come to a conclusion about the state of his karma.
And that scene with the still images, now, I saw that without any of the background knowledge that you just explained, right?
Oh, wow.
So I hit that cold, and quite obviously that was one of the scenes that left me rather baffled. And because, I mean, there's the images that you described, but we also see people in civilian clothes shot in the act of conflict, look like they're throwing stones, and we keep seeing that figure in the gorilla suit, which of course cannot help but evoke the monkey ghost elsewhere in the film. And the last image, if I'm not mistaken, of those still images is of those, I think it's mainly the people in civilian clothes, but the people we've been seeing standing with the guy in the gorilla suit behind them, still wearing that noose, but with his arms around them as they pose for a picture. And this is happening while Uncle Boonmee is narrating a vision of the future. And what he's describing sounds like a symbolic or metaphorical account of government oppression, but in a future fantastical context, which is then linked with these still images that certainly don't feel of the future at all, but of the past, and with that contagion of imagery like we had between the princess myth and the rest of the film. And so it's this another moment that's discrete, yet linked, but in ways that left me with questions and no answers.
Yeah, I mean, I think like some of the lines he's talking about while those images are playing has to do with like his notion of what past and future selves means. Like the title of this movie, Uncle Boonmee Who Can Recall His Past Lives, very little of this movie is what normal people would typically say when we mean past lives. What we mean is like reincarnation. But this film isn't really about reincarnation. It's about various versions of himself throughout his life that are different selves. And there's at one point, I think he says, I can't remember who he says it to, but he basically says something to the effect of, those things in the past, as you kind of move forward, like they just get left behind, right? You move past those things. And that set of images, you're right. Like it harkens back to a past, not to a theoretical future, but he's talking about what the future could look like as we're being given these images of the past. So it's sort of like Boonmee offering a version of himself that won't exist because he's not going to see the future. He's going to leave behind this one, but is giving us all of these versions of himself throughout his story. And one of the versions of himself is potentially one of the soldiers or one of the civilians, where potentially, I suppose, are supposed to see this gorilla suit as a sort of dehumanized communist, maybe, or something. But it's, again, the film does not answer that for us. It makes us think about it.
Well, what you've just said about the way past lives is meant here certainly made a light bulb go on for me regarding the ending, and linking that to the director's love of cinema and specifically film. So if our past lives are, yes, not regarding reincarnation, but our lives of our past, how we change, how we are constantly in a process of changing and becoming, and who we are now is not who we were even just moments ago, right? And then think about what is the nature of cinema, right? A succession of still images, 24 frames per second, where the past is constantly being left behind, but there's that persistence of vision that allows us to see it, to see movement. So cinema is this perpetual change predicated on a visual memory of the past, as it succeeds moment by moment, 24th of a second by 24th of a second. So when, at the end of the film, Boonmee's son and sister get up and leave themselves behind, we're getting another cleavage from the past, right? But using cinema to give us the visual representation of even the most minor deviation, or rather departure. The past is now them sitting on the bed watching television as we get the other selves that go into the future, or rather that are in the present that we follow as we leave them, just as the son has left another version of himself behind, perhaps two, becoming a monk, but now that at the end, is he entirely comfortable with being one? Is he leaving that behind again? So we are getting a succession of selves, a succession of transformations, mirroring the very nature of cinema itself.
Yeah, everything you're saying, 100%. I mean, this is his lamentation, as he has said, about the death of cinema, of literal physical film.
Which also explains to me, I mean, when I saw that explained to me why, I mean, Memoria, his most recent film, which I would really like to see, and remains inaccessible to us because he has insisted on it only having theatrical release. So that's why we're not seeing it on any streaming service.
Like it'll never be available?
Well, I imagine eventually, perhaps, but that's why it's been out for quite a while. You can't get it in any form except right now, except if it happens to show up in the theaters. So I'm wondering if that's connected to. I mean, here I'm speculating, but given what he is saying about his lamentation of the loss of cinema, the loss of film, if that is one of the reasons why he's insisting on it being theatrical only. And many people have pointed out how much has been lost visually in the move to digital, how ugly films have become in the move away from celluloid.
Well, you're making me think there too of like the history of film, like the amount of silent films that are just gone. Mm-hmm. That we know they were made, but the film is lost somewhere to the ether. So like there's this long history of film has had a hard time, for various reasons, of being able to maintain itself over time. And the shift to digital is one other example because of what you're talking about here.
Yeah. On the other hand, films are being, in some respects, being preserved as they never have been before, right? But it is, unlike print, so much more dependent on technology, which constantly changes, right? And I mean, we're getting sidetracked here, but I mean, I'm certainly an advocate of physical media, though, and also, gradually adjusted to the fact that, well, there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to be getting that's going to be digital, and that's going to be the way that I'm going to own it. But also realizing that even, okay, there's a movie that's really important to me. I want to have the physical film, the disc, but even that's not forever. Even setting aside the questions of how long it lasts, I mean, I had a VHS collection. It has now disappeared because that physical medium became unplayable. The machines broke down. I could no longer get a machine that would allow me to play this medium. So that disappears. I mean, I think a lot of the discussion about the move to digital is talking about not the preservation of film, but just what that does to the image itself, right? When we're also dealing with the long-term effects of 3D, which has led to films being shown with bad bulbs and the degeneration of the cinematic experience in theaters, and then with the pandemic, what the long-term effect is going to be. I mean, we will always have movies, but will we always have theaters? And the way of watching a film where you are not being distracted by everything else in your life, right? I mean, that's one of the things about the movie theater, at least theoretically, right? You're not going to be checking your phone. You're not going to be, you don't have to let the dog out. You're sitting in a dark room with your senses dominated by this huge image.
Yeah, you immerse yourself, or at least theoretically, you're supposed to immerse yourself in the experience. Yeah. Well, I mean, that is like a huge...
yeah, that's a whole other issue.
Yeah. But I think it's part of... While the film itself isn't like explicitly bringing a lot of this up, it's clear in the director's interest that this film was shot the way it was precisely because of what's happening to... Even in 2010, right? He could see the shift coming. So... To some degree, this film is, if you want to say Uncle Boonmee, is in fact the literal film celluloid, and its death, and a meditation upon its death of its many pasts. Obviously, there's other stuff kind of going on. I love this film, and while it makes us think of a lot of all of these things, it is really remarkable, I think, for all of the things that we've discussed. Like, you will note, we had almost nothing negative. I don't think we said a negative thing about this movie at any point.
And it is definitely, it's a film that has a deep, deep love of its medium and of the image, right? From the opening second with that water buffalo. And really that sets the tone, right? Because it's a long take of a buffalo doing nothing.
Well, he's not doing nothing. He gained freedom.
But before he gets freedom, it's a long take of him just there.
Oh, he's contemplating. No,
he's contemplating.
You got to learn how to speak. You speak the water buffalo. What are you doing, David?
But this is my point, right? We have like the image is very still. It's a contemplative. Yet we are invited to just be there in this space, looking at that space, at the figure within, and it gets us into that contemplative mode where we are going to be gazing for long times at all corners of this beautiful frame.
I agree 100%. Yeah, I think that is a lot of what's going on here. And I think that this is worth watching. I would get it on Blu-ray so you can watch it on a large screen, because I would not recommend watching it on a small screen like a laptop, which is how I was watching it. Because I think this film deserves, to some degree, to have as much of its ability to suck you into it as possible. And the more you can distract yourself from anything else around you, I think the better. Which may go back to what you were saying before, that perhaps to some degree, that is what this director, Weerasethakul, is going for. That he is trying to create an experience in which you just let yourself be taken in. Whether or not it has a plot or a clear story, you are in this moment. In this case, with a bunch of people living their lives in the Isan region of Thailand. So we need to close out.
All right.
because I think we could talk more, but we can't talk forever. As always, let us know if you have any thoughts, if you've watched this film, etc. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Go over to skiffnyfanny.com/listener suggestions. As we always do, though, one of us gets to pick the movie. This was my movie, so that's why I went first. And David now gets to tell us what's the next movie we're going to watch.
The next movie we will not be describing as contemplative or meditative. There are many ways in which it can be described, but those are not the words that we'll be able to use.
Oh,
So
boy.
we're off to India next time, which we haven't been to yet. We are going to see Eega. EEGA. You can find it on Prime. It is a wild ride and so much fun.
All right, so dancing?
Oh yeah, you got dancing, you've got superheroics, you've got reincarnation.
Oh, David.
You have, most of all, a fly.
Nice. Okay, that sounds fantastic. All right, folks, so we're going to watch Eega next time. Yeah, this is going to be great. So if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Skiffingfanty on Twitter and Instagram and get the newsletter at skiffingfanty.com/newsletter. And if you like what we do, please go to patreon.com/skiffingfanty and give us like $1. And then obviously 5-star reviews on iTunes and those other lovely places. As for me, you can find me at Sean Duke on Twitter, SeanDuke.net, Alphabet Streams on Twitch, and patreon.com/thejoyfactory. I'm also on Mastodon at Sean Duke on thewandering.shop if you want to find me there.
And you can find me on Twitter at David_Annandale or davidannandale.com.
And read his books.
Yes, please do that. Buy them too.
Yeah, buy them, read them, then buy them again and read them again.
Yeah, because you're only allowed to read an individual copy once. Yeah, if you want to reread, you have to buy a second one.
Yeah, and you just keep doing that. It's like it's David's books all the way down, like Turtles.
Exactly.
All right, folks. We'll see everybody next time. Thanks again, David. This is a lot of fun.
It has been.
All right. I don't know. Like this is awkward now. I'm gonna turn into a monkey ghost. So awkward ending and scene.
Bye.
If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.